Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the books of Kings and Chronicles as we continue our Old Testament survey. If you remember, we divided the books of the Old Testament into four sections. There was the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, then the historical books, that section in which we're now looking at, Joshua all the way down to Esther. Thirdly, the poetic books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then the prophets, the prophetic books going from Isaiah all the way down through the minor prophets all the way to Malachi. We're in the middle of the historical books, and so we pick up now with 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. When we last looked, we were going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we noted that it told the story of Samuel and Saul, and then David comes on the scene, and 2nd Samuel is all about David's reign as king. 1st Kings begins with David still on the throne, but now Solomon's going to be given the kingdom, and we'll see Solomon all the way through the fall of the divided kingdom. I want to expand on that just a bit as we look at that in a bit more depth. 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11 is the united kingdom under Solomon. And Israel is united, Israel is at peace, Israel is unified. But then after the death of Solomon, the nation of Israel is going to split into two parts. We're going to have the north secede from the south, so we'll have the northern kingdom, and from this point on, only the northern kingdom will be described as Israel. The southern kingdom will be described as the kingdom of Judah. So I'm going to try to remember to speak of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. That's going to begin in 1 Kings chapter 12 and go all the way into 2 Kings chapter 17. And that's when the northern kingdom is taken away into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians. And from that point on, 2 Kings chapter 18 through 25, it will be the southern kingdom of Judah by itself. 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 21, once Solomon comes to the throne, we read about how Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river, and when you say the river, you're speaking of the Euphrates River, far to the north of Israel, from the river to the land of the Philistines, that area on the southeastern Mediterranean where it sort of juts in off the coast, that's the Philistia area, and to the border of Egypt. So the territory of Solomon goes all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, and perhaps a bit more than we've shown, all the way to the border of Egypt would be close to the Nile River. And we read that all of these kingdoms, including Egypt, all of these kingdoms brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree. We're going to see that reference again and again, both in Kings, in the prophets. It will be the glory time of Israel when everybody lived in safety, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba. Now those are the actual borders of Israel. The other that we were looking at was just the territories over which Solomon exercised influence, but actually the land of Israel goes from Dan, that's as far north as you can be and still be in Israel, to Beersheba, that's as far south you can be and still be in Beersheba, and this was the territory all the days of Solomon. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls. You know, when I think about it, it probably did originally read 4,000. Our Masoretic text and most of our translation says that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. It's been noted that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, made very early in its history, going back to around 200 to maybe even 250 BC, the Septuagint actually reads that Solomon had 4,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. That's probably a bit more accurate. Might have been somebody did what I did as I was just reading it. I mistakenly turned the numbers around, and it might be that one of the early scribes did exactly the same thing. Moreover, Deuteronomy tells us, back in Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, that a king was not to multiply horses for himself. And Solomon is doing that. The picture that you see here is reputed to be one of Solomon's stables. You actually have what they would call feeding troughs or mangers. Notice they're all made of stone. And this is at Megiddo on the valley of Jezreel. And so Solomon was doing something that was actually contrary to the instructions of the Lord, as had been given way back in the book of Deuteronomy. Psalms chapter 20 and verse 7 reminds us how some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. And that was probably why God had given that injunction that a king should not multiply horses for himself, lest he be tempted to trust in his own prowess, his own strength, rather than in the name of the Lord. Well, we read that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, and then we have references to several very wise men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, than Heman, than Calcol, and Darda, folks that I don't know, but apparently they were known back in the day when this was written, sons of Mahol. And his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. Solomon had vast interests and vast knowledge that spanned a wide variety of topics. Well, 1 Kings chapters 1 through 8 are the good times of Solomon. First of all, he comes to the throne. That's in chapters 1 and 2. And there is a to-do about that. It's not a simple transition. David is giving him the throne, but one of the other sons of David is plotting and trying to get his way. And then once Solomon comes to the throne, we read about his wisdom, his wealth. That's in chapters 3 and 4. And then chapters 5 through 8 are about Solomon building a house to the Lord. He builds the temple. Now it came about, 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Now we backtrack this. We know about when Solomon died, and that means we can go back to roughly his 4th year. And according to Thiel is the author of the excellent book, Chronology of the Hebrew Kings. He has figured out all these numbers. I haven't tried to do that, but I think he's at least in the ballpark, if not exactly right on. He puts the beginning of Solomon's reign at 971 BC, and so we can do the math. We can go back the 480 years from the 4th year of Solomon's reign, and that takes us roughly to 1447 BC, and that is what we have used for our date for the Exodus, roughly anywhere between 1450, 1440 BC, somewhere in that area, we have the Exodus of Israel from Egypt. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. We've heard the name Moriah way back in Genesis chapter 22 when Abraham took his son Isaac to offer him to the Lord as the Lord had commanded. It was to the land of Moriah. Now we read about a specific Mount Moriah, and we read that this is where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite. That was back in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1. We looked at that last time in our study of the life of David. And that becomes the scene on which Solomon's going to build his temple. So you have the city of Jerusalem. Notice our artwork below, stretching along that very narrow ridge. And then where that ridge connects to the higher mountain to the north, there you see the temple. There you see the temple. It is laid out in a familiar pattern. If you had been in probably a number of different temples throughout the ancient world, you would have seen the same pattern, where there would be a porch out front and then the main hall, and then if the temple is not flat, if it's as this temple was, built on the top of a mountain, then the very innermost part as well as the highest part would likely be the what we call the shrine, the most holy place, or as we say it literally in Hebrew, the Holy of Holies. Now the dimensions of the temple are exactly double that of the tabernacle, so that well, let's look down at the Holy of Holies. We see a little bit better here. The Holy of Holies was 10 cubits by 10 cubits by 10 cubits if you were in the tabernacle. When you come to the temple, notice everything is doubled. It's 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. Cubit is roughly the distance from your fingertip to your elbow. We say we're going to round that off to about 30 feet for the Holy of Holies, and it's the same dimensions, tall as it is wide as it is long. It's a perfect cube. So you have the temple, and you remember that the original tabernacle had a table of showbread, and then the lampstand. Now we're going to have a number of lampstands, a number of tables of showbread, still have one altar of incense, and then notice how a picture has hinted the idea of steps going up to the Holy of Holies. If you go to what's called the Temple Mount today, you will see a risen area. It's called the Dome of the Rock, and if you were allowed to go inside the Dome of the Rock, and usually only Muslims are permitted to go in, but if you were permitted to go in, you would see an elevated rock. That would be the highest part of the mountain, and that seems to have been where the Holy of Holies was located. Here's another picture again showing the number of lampstands, the number of tables as you made your way, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies proper. Only the high priest was allowed inside. Here's a picture I took a number of years ago of the Dome of the Rock, and you can see you're going upstairs to get to the dome. If you're on the Temple Mount, you go to the very top of the Temple Mount, and that's the dome. And if you won't go inside the dome, and here's a picture of compliments of National Geographic magazine from quite a number of years ago. You see this raised rock, and that's what gives it its name, the Dome of the Rock. Now, on the outside of the temple, you had still the altar, the altar upon which sacrifices would be given. But instead of a portable altar, this is a huge altar assembly now. And instead of a portable little laver of water, you have a giant laver of water. In fact, it was so big they would refer to it as the sea. Now, we read in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, that King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, and then we have mentioned some of these others in addition to the Egyptian princes, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. And Solomon does exactly what had been forbidden. He not only associates, he associates very closely. He marries these various princesses. These are alliances of marriage. He's doing this to sort of expand his kingdom. And yet he's doing so in a way that the Lord had forbidden. And we read that Solomon held fast to these in love. He grew fond of these various women. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives in particular turned his heart away, for when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord as his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. And it came about at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem. Now, Jeroboam was the chief foreman working for King Solomon. He was in charge of all the building projects. It was his job to make sure everybody did their job. And as Jeroboam walks out of Jerusalem one day, that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now, Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak. Do you remember the last time we specifically looked at cloaks? We saw that the cloak worn by Samuel had been torn by Saul, and Samuel had used that as a sign, and it said, in the same way you tore my cloak, so the kingdom will be torn from you. So now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. And then Ahijah took hold. Ahijah, the prophet, takes hold of the new cloak that he's wearing, and he tears it. But he just doesn't tear it in two. He tears it into 12 pieces. Where have I seen that symbolism? That symbolism of back in the book of Judges where a concubine is murdered and she's torn or cut into 12 pieces. And then Saul, his call to action had been to take his oxen and slay them, offer them as sacrifice, and then cut them into 12 pieces. So here the imagery all comes together in this act as Ahijah takes this new cloak, tears it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and give you 10 tribes. So each piece represents a tribe. That's a familiar symbolism, verse 32. But he will have one tribe. You say, wait a minute, I've got 10 minus 1, that's 11, or 10 plus 1, that's 11. What about the others? Well, you almost don't count Benjamin because it's such a small tribe, and they sort of come to be associated with Judah. And also there's the tribe of Levi. It's a little test question that sometimes I ask. How many tribes were there? There were 12 sons of Joseph, but technically there were 13 tribes because the tribe of Levi did not get an inheritance. The Lord was their inheritance. And they're also going to be more and more associated with where the temple is, of course, and with the southern kingdom of Judah. So verse 32, but he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtaroth. Here's the reason why it's taken away from Solomon. They've worshipped these other gods, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and observing my statutes and my ordinances, as his father David did. They didn't act like David, and that's a problem. They did not, and I'm not talking about David's adultery or his murder, but his desire to follow the Lord. So when Solomon dies, what we're going to have is a division. Now we'll have Judah in the south, and when we refer to Israel, that will be only the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. Now this takes place in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1, where Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, after Solomon has died, then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. It was not automatic that he would be recognized as king. He has to come and be recognized. And he comes to this place, Shechem. The name Shechem means it's actually the space between your shoulder blades. And if you can imagine these two mountains on either side, Gerizim and Ebal, are sort of like shoulder blades, and then Shechem sort of lies, right in that hollow. And this is the same place where Jacob's well had been dug, and this is also the same place where hundreds of years later, where Jesus is going to come to this town, which by now will be called Sychar, and he'll have an afternoon discussion with a Samaritan woman. So they come to Shechem, and when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, he was living in Egypt because he had to flee down to Egypt. He had fled from the presence of King Solomon. When word had got out about that prophecy, he had to leave town in a hurry, lest Solomon tried to put him to death. Verse 3, then they sent and called him, so he comes to represent the northern tribes. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke hard. Now we want to make sure we distinguish between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. I know the names sound alike. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. Jeroboam had been the chief foreman of Solomon, and now he's representing, so I think of him as a union organizer maybe. He's representing the tribes of Israel. And they say, verse 4, your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. So you have Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Rehoboam, he's the son of Solomon, heir apparent to the kingdom, but it has to be ratified. Jeroboam, he is the former appointee over the labor projects of Solomon. Rehoboam seems to have been a young man. Now maybe that's relative, but Jeroboam seems to be considered more mature, Maybe he's had more experience. I'm not sure if he's actually older in years, but very, very likely he was. Rehoboam's from the tribe of Judah, although his mother is a princess of Ammon, one of those princesses that Solomon had married. Jeroboam, by contrast, is from the tribe of Ephraim. He is from one of those northern tribes. And so King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father, Solomon, while he was still alive, saying, "How do you counsel me to answer this people?" And they spoke to him, saying, "If you will be a servant to this people today, and will serve them and grant them their petition, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. Speak to them nicely, and they're in your pocket." But he forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given him, and instead he goes and he consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. So he said to them, "What counsel do you give me that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, 'Lighten the yoke which your father put on us'?" And now he gets advice, a very different sort of advice. The young men who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, "Thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, 'Your fathers made our yoke heavy, now make it lighter for us.' But you shall speak to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins.'" If that sounds a little on the risque side, if that sounds rather harsh, it is. It's very, very harsh. It's very explicit. It's rather crude. He goes on to say, "Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions." You haven't seen anything yet. So here we have the contrast. The elders, the older advisors, they say, and these are the ones who had served as advisors to Solomon, so they've had some experience dealing with the people. The young men, on the other hand, they've grown up with Rehoboam. They haven't had experience at anything. They're sort of backseat drivers and don't really have any good experience at this. The elders say, "Be a servant to the people, grant them their petitions, speak good words to them." The young men say, "Threaten the people with even greater burdens." And who does he listen to? He listens to his friends. The king answered the people harshly, for he took the advice of the elders which they had given him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. Here's what my father did. He made your yoke heavy. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add to your yoke. Here's what my father did. He disciplined you with whips. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, but notice we have now a commentary that's inserted. "For it was a turn of events from the Lord." God is the one who's bringing this about. Yes, Rehoboam's making his own decision. Rehoboam's listening to counsel and deciding on it, using his own quote-unquote free will. But on the other hand, it was a turn of events from the Lord. God is the one who brought this about in order that he might establish his word, which the Lord had spoke through Ahijah the Silonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And so God is the one who brings this about, who wins, and who causes the nation to be divided. This reminds us of the Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." If anyone had free will, it was the king. But notice how the Lord had maneuvered Rehoboam to make the decision that the Lord wanted to bring about. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Now look after your own house, David." So Israel departed to their tents, but as for the sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So Rehoboam continues to reign over Judah and over that area, but he has lost the northern tribes. So we have a division now between Israel in the north. I'm going to try to remember to call it the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and Judah in the south. So we have the king of the south, that's Judah. The king in the north, that's Israel. And Jeroboam is going to now be the leader of that northern kingdom. And we read in chapter 12, verse 25, that Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. Now, there was already a city called Shechem, but he builds it up. He makes it into one of his capitals, and he lived there. And he went out from there, and he builds another capital. Notice the wisdom that he's showing. I'm going to have one capital on one side of the Jordan, and just so those 2.5 tribes that are on the other side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, just so they don't feel alienated, I'll build a capital there too, and I will name it Penuel. Now, Penuel was a place that the name had been given way back in the days of Jacob, where Jacob had a wrestling match there on the Jabbok River, and had named the place Penuel, which means face of God. That he said, I've seen the face of God. And now, this brings up a problem. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. You see, the place of worship, there's only one place of worship, and that was down in Jerusalem, and that's now become associated, it wasn't originally, but now it's become associated with Judah, and that's where Rehoboam is. And he says, and Jeroboam says, I can't have my people going down there to worship. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves. He thinks to himself, after all, it was good enough for Aaron in the days of Moses, it's good enough for us. The king consulted, made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Let me give you a easier way to worship you. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. It's an old tradition. See how Aaron's sin continues to bear fruit. And he set one of them in Bethel. That's right on the border. You go as far south as you can go. Just before you get to Judah and Jerusalem is Bethel. And he puts one of these golden calves there. And he puts another one in Dan. That's actually a bit off our map, just off our map, as far north as you can go and still be in Israel. And so Bethel and Dan become the 2 places of alternate worship. And that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing, because God has said, here's how I want you to worship me. It's not to be with graven images. It's not to be with golden calves. And it is to be in one particular place. It is to be in Jerusalem. You can go today to the high place at Dan. This is a picture of that. And they have done an archaeological dig, shown the foundations. You can see where the altar would have stood, and the steps going up to the temple proper there in Dan. And this becomes a place of great sin. Now this thing became a sin, we read, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan, and he made houses on high places, and made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. So he's abandoning everything that the Bible says in Leviticus, abandoning everything God had said in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. He's abandoning the law for his own purposes. So we have the divided nation. And we have the capitals at Shechem and Penuel, the places of worship at Bethel and Dan. And a bit later, it's not going to be Jeroboam that does this, but a later dynasty, we're going to have the capital moved a bit to the northwest, actually a bit further than is shown on our map, to a place called Samaria. Samaria means shamar is to guard. So it's going to be sort of the place of guarding. And it's a good place to have a capital. It's just right on the dividing road, and you can look to the west and you can see the ocean. Anybody going down the road there, and you can look to the east, and it covers sort of all the bases. But that's going to be the later capital to replace Shechem and Penuel. Now, a summary of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. We have the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, and we're going to have 19 kings reigning over Judah. There will be a brief period where there's a queen instead of a king. That won't be a good thing. That'll be at Judah's low point. And there'll also be 19 kings over the northern kingdom of Israel. And you say, man, that's sort of sounds like things are going the same in both places. But remember, the northern kingdom of Israel isn't going to last nearly so long. It will be taken into captivity over 100 years earlier, which means that those 19 kings that reign over Israel reign on the average for a much shorter period than the 19 kings and one queen who reign in Judah. The capital of the southern kingdom of Judah is Jerusalem. The capital of the northern kingdom of Israel starts out as Shechem and eventually becomes Samaria. The southern kingdom of Judah has the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and I would also include the Levites there. The northern kingdom of Israel has the 10 northern tribes. The southern kingdom of Judah, when we look at the kings, most of them were unstable. You have a few good ones. You have some that were bad. You look at the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, they're all bad. And of those all bad kings, two of them, Ahab and Hezekiah, were actual worshippers of a different god. They were idol worshippers, not only worshiping at the golden calves, but actually not even using those to worship the Lord. They're actually saying, forget the Lord, we're going to go worship some other god. The southern kingdom will last until the year 586 BC. If you say 587, that's okay. I'm not going to quibble over the year. But I'll continue saying that. It's conquered by Babylon, taken away in captivity, destroyed in 586 BC. The northern kingdom of Israel, much earlier, will be conquered by Assyria in the year 721 BC. Now, the southern kingdom, after it's taken away into captivity, they will eventually return to the land. The northern kingdom will see no return, not at least as a unified group of tribes. You will have a scattered remnant. You'll have people that sort of drift back into the land from representing some of those different tribes, because we talk sometimes about the lost tribes of Israel. Well, they're not really lost. They knew who they were, and so some of them came back into the land. But when they came back into the land, often they amalgamated with Judah in the south, and they just all became known as Jews. And eventually, given enough time, and I'm not even talking even by the New Testament, but even after that, eventually, many of them, if not all of them, will lose their tribal identity. They'll still know themselves as Israelites, and they'll refer to themselves as Jews, but they won't be able to tell you eventually from what tribe they come. Now I'm going to jump forward a number of years, about 100 years, and we're looking at one king in Israel, Omri. He doesn't get a lot of pages in the Bible, although history tells us a bit more about him. He seems to be a very robust king, and he's bringing Israel to a very high point, and he enters into an alliance with the king of Sidon, the Phoenician king Ethbaal, or we might call him Etobaal. And it's a marital alliance in which Omri has his son Ahab marry the daughter of Ethbaal, and her name is Jezebel. And we're going to see her play a prominent role in the last part of 1 Kings, early part of 2 Kings, because a prophet comes upon the scene, and his name is Elijah. Now, Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, remember Gilead's always on the east side of the Jordan, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. And for 3 years it doesn't rain. Now, if it doesn't rain in Egypt, that's not a big deal, because it rains way, 4,000 miles south of Egypt, down in the mountains around Lake Victoria. It rains there, and the water comes up the Nile and waters the land of Egypt. But if it doesn't rain in Israel, Israel doesn't have that kind of big major river. And if it doesn't rain in Israel, everything dies. And for 3.5 years, everything died. This is the judgment of God upon the land. And then at the end of that time, Elijah, and he's had some travels, trying to escape King Ahab, but he issues a challenge to have King Ahab meet him on Mount Carmel, and they are going to have a battle of the gods. It will be Yahweh versus Baal. Baal is the Phoenician god, that's what they call him. And so Ahab's God against Elijah's God. And the question is, which one is able to call fire down from heaven? And the multitude have gathered, and all the priests of Baal have gathered. And the question before the house is, who will you serve? Whatever God is able to accomplish this, he will be God, and that is the one you should serve. And of course, you know the story. The prophets of Baal, they call upon Baal all day. In the middle of the day, Elijah's sort of having fun with them. He's saying, call a bit louder. Maybe your God's in the bathroom and he can't hear you, and toilet's flushing, or maybe it's on the telephone. And he gives sort of the ancient equivalent of those little jibes. And then when it's all over, Elijah prays, and fire comes down from heaven, and Elijah turns the heart of the people back to God. The false prophets of Baal are put to death, and at least for a brief time, many in Israel begin to turn back to the Lord. Now, an outline, and I'm passing over many things that Elijah does, and eventually he's going to be replaced by Elisha. But I want to give you this outline of 1st and 2nd Kings to bring the whole story sort of into focus. Notice how we begin with the United Kingdom of Solomon, 1 Kings chapters 1 through 12. And we've already talked about the kingdom was originally united, and then after the death of Solomon, it divides. And that takes place in chapter 13. And 1 Kings chapter 13 through 16 are wars of Judah and Israel. Now, they're not initially fighting each other, although they're about to, but the Lord says, no, don't go fighting each other. And so they say, okay, we won't, at least not right now. They eventually do, but they're fighting other people, and eventually they're fighting each other too. And then we just mentioned the coming of Elijah, and the ministry of Elijah starts in 1 Kings chapter 17, and it takes us all the way to 2 Kings. I want you to see that 1st and 2nd Kings are not two separate and distinct books totally divorced from each other. The division between the two is one out of convenience for us, and maybe even some early manuscripts. I'm not sure if that took place or not. But it's one united writing. And so we have the ministry of Elijah all the way to 2 Kings chapter 1. And then in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah is at the end of his ministry, but instead of dying, he's going to be caught up to heaven while he's alive. And he passes the prophetic mantle from himself to his servant Elisha. And Elisha prays and says, can I have your inheritance? Not your financial inheritance, but can I have your spiritual inheritance? And Elijah says, well, that's not really mine to give. But if you see me when I leave, when I'm caught up, then you will receive a double portion of my spirit. And Elisha sees that. And now we have the ministry of Elisha from 2 Kings chapter 3 all the way to 2 Kings chapter 13. And if you thought the ministry of Elijah was something, fire coming down from heaven, and he says don't rain, and it didn't rain, and all sorts of other things, the ministry of Elisha, it's as though everything is times two. Not literally speaking, but there's so many more miracles that are mentioned. And so we have the ministry of Elisha. And then we have, notice how we had back in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 13 through 16. Now corresponding to that, in 2 Kings chapters 14 through 17, we have, again, wars of Judah and Israel. And it ends with a war of Israel against the nation of Assyria. And Assyria wins, and Assyria wins big because the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, is taken away now into captivity. So that now in 2 Kings, beginning in chapter 18, you have just the kingdom of Judah, and it's Judah by itself, because there is no more northern kingdom of Israel. Now we left off with Jezebel and Ahab and the direction in which they had taken the nation of Israel, and we saw how Elijah turned that around in a big way, although Ahab and Jezebel are still on the throne at that point. And now Ahab enters into a military alliance with Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and just as his father had done by sealing that alliance with marriage, so Ahab does the same thing. and they have several children, including a daughter named Athaliah, and they marry Athaliah to the son of Jehoshaphat, Jehoram. The names are going to get a little confusing here because we have Jehoram, and yet we also have one of the sons of Ahab and Jezebel named Joram, and sometimes that's actually spelled like it looks like Jehoram, so it's just two renditions of the same name, two different people with the same or similar sounding names. And it's going to continue on into the next generation because Jehoram and Athaliah, they also have a son who will be Ahaziah, who's apparently named after his uncle on his mother's side, another Ahaziah there. And things are going to go bad to worse, especially when Ahaziah is killed along with one of his uncles, and that leaves, Judah without a king upon the throne, and Athaliah, the queen, daughter of Jezebel, and they say the acorn doesn't fall far from the whatever kind of tree acorns come from, but Athaliah is acting much like Jezebel, and in this case, she goes out and she murders all of the other royal family. Anybody she can get her hands on are put to death, so that there will be no line in Judah. Now remember, if there's no line in Judah, then there is no promised son of David to sit upon the throne, which had been part of the covenant that God made. And if there's no promised son of David, there's no Messiah. And if there's no Messiah, there's no salvation. And if there's no salvation, we're going to hell. So this is bad news, not just for those that are there. This would be bad news for us. The good news is that she misses one of her grandsons, Joash, and he's hidden in the last place that she thinks to look. He's hidden in the temple, which is largely abandoned at this period as she's leading the people into idol worship and the worship of false gods. But Joash is hidden in the temple, and eventually when he's around 7 years old, he's brought out, and she is put to death, and young Joash with his guardian, who the high priest is sort of overseeing him, reigns, and as long as that guardian's alive, things are going good, and so the line continues. Now we want to move back to the north. We already talked about the fall of Israel, but I want to look at that in a bit more depth. Notice the map that it speaks about Jonah's world. And of course we have Jerusalem because I'm not sure actually where Jonah was setting his roots, but he seems to be a prophet. I'm not sure if he's in the north or the south. He's eventually going to be a prophet to Nineveh. And he's told to go to the city of Nineveh and proclaim to them that they have 40 days left and then they're going to be destroyed. And Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Now, to understand what that meant to Jonah and why he wants to run in the other direction, the Assyrians were known for their terror tactics. Even the Bible talks about them putting fish hooks through the nose of their victims, blinding the eyes of their victims. Their own wall paintings brag about how they would have games taking their victims and skinning them alive, seeing who could get the most skin off, and tearing out beards and teeth and tongues and all sorts of things like that. The Assyrians seem to have invented a form of crucifixion, which is sort of crucifixion plus impaling plus whatever all other bad things they can do. Notice in this wall painting you have some of the heads of their victims are piled up on the ground around them. And then another painting shows them cutting off the arms and legs and then adorning a city wall with the heads of their victims. It's no small wonder that Jonah wants to run the other way, and this is the kingdom that comes against the northern kingdom, so that in the year 721 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls, and Samaria falls. Today you go to Samaria, and there's just farmland. There's not even ruins to speak of. It's been converted into rural farmland. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Assyria away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river Gozarks, and in the cities of the Medes. Now, we're going to read about the Medes in a bit, but the northern kingdom of Israel now has ceased to exist. Now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel, and the customs of the kings of Israel which they had introduced. So Israel is no more, and meanwhile, in the south, we have King Hezekiah coming to the throne, and he is facing the Assyrians because they're not done yet. Their plan is next to come up against Judah and take Judah into captivity in the same way. And Hezekiah comes on the scene, and he begins with a series of reforms. First of all, a religious reform, where he calls the people to return to the Lord. Next, we read about, and this is mentioned both in Kings as well as in Isaiah, where he receives envoys from the king of Babylon. Now, Babylon in his day is a second-rate power, but he receives envoys from Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylon, the king of that particular city, and he shows them all around, shows them all his treasures. We get the sense maybe he's showing off a little bit. And Isaiah says, you shouldn't have been doing that. Because of that, Babylon, one of these days, is going to come back to get all that treasure, to get all that gold with which you've been showing off, and that wasn't a good thing. Next, Hezekiah finds himself revolting, or seen to revolt, whether he's doing it purposefully or not. There's a revolt against Assyria, and Assyria comes down to conquer Hezekiah. Now, in preparation for their coming, Hezekiah is trying to fortify Jerusalem, and some interesting things take place along this line. There was discovered back in the 1800s a tunnel, and it's known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. It goes through underneath the entire part of David City. You can see it here listed on this chart. It sort of zigzags its way. I've been through the tunnel, and it carries water from the spring on the north side all the way down to a pool which empties on the south side of the city, but within the city walls, so that you always have now water inside the city. You can go inside the tunnel itself. I was there a number of years ago, walking through and it's about 1,700 feet from one end to the other. In places the ceiling is rather low, and in places it gets rather high as you're following the water. And the time of year we were there, it was in the summertime, so the water wasn't all that high. You come to the end. Now, they didn't have this when I was there. My older brother was there just last year, and there's an inscription. When I was there, there was just a big hole there because archaeologists, actually it had been Turkish archaeologists, had cut the inscription that had been discovered there out of the rock, and they had taken it to the museum in Istanbul. So if you go to Istanbul, and I've been there as well, if you go to Istanbul, you can go to the museum and see the original the rock face that's called Hezekiah's inscription that's there. But now if you go to Hezekiah's Tunnel, where my brother here is shining the light, you can see a replica of the inscription, and it tells the same story that the book of 2 Kings tells. Only it tells it from the workers' point of view, about how they dug this tunnel, and one team of workers were on one side and one were on the other, and they sort of met in the middle, and they had a big party and rejoicing when they finally dug this. They don't really talk a lot about Hezekiah because, after all, he's up in his palace doing his thing. Sure enough, the Assyrians come up against Hezekiah. They come up against Jerusalem. They threaten to capture the city. And when all seems lost, we read that it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, that's the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. He only lived for a short time there, and then he too was ultimately assassinated. Now, the Assyrians do not actually tell the story of losing 185,000 soldiers. In fact, the Assyrians, much like the Egyptians, never talk about their own defeats. It's a bit like when we, my wife and I were watching the television way back when the Americans rolled into Baghdad in what they called the Second Gulf War. And we were watching these embedded journalists who were in Baghdad, and they had their cameras focused upon the Minister of News, translated Minister of Propaganda, the Iraqi minister there. And he's standing up there facing the cameras, and he says, "We have won the war. The Americans are all dead in the desert. We have won the victory." And all of a sudden the camera, you actually hear a voice outside of the camera range saying, "What's that?" And all of a sudden the camera just pans to the right, looks down the street, and there's American tanks rolling into the city of Baghdad. And this minister of propaganda says, "Don't look at that, don't look at that. We won, we won." Now, I saw that with my own eyes. Notice things haven't changed in 3,000 years, because way back in Sennacherib's day, he goes back home and he records, he says, "This city I defeated, and that city I defeated, and that king I hung up by the heels, and I cut this king's legs off, and I did all these things. As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities, as well as their small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by Escalade and bringing up siege engines," he's describing all the war. And then he talking about Hezekiah himself, "like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city." Notice he says, "I came to Hezekiah, I killed all these other kings, and I came to Hezekiah, and I surrounded him." And that's all it says. Then it stops, because he can't say that he defeated Hezekiah, because Hezekiah is still very much alive. And so he paints himself as though he won this great victory, but really it was anything but. In fact, it was a great defeat that the Lord had won. The Lord had won the victory. Now, we go to a couple of generations later, just like we had a reform under Hezekiah. Unfortunately, his son and grandson don't really continue those. But then his great-grandson, Josiah, likewise brings about a reform, again a religious reform, where he's saying, "Go cleanse the temple and bring it back up to what it ought to be." And it's during this time that Assyria falls. Nineveh is captured, destroyed, never to be rebuilt, and that dreadful kingdom of Assyria that for so long had threatened Judah, had taken Israel into captivity, it now falls to the hands of actually two different groups of people. Three, depending on how you count. The the city of Babylon, with its king Nabopolassar and its young prince Nebuchadnezzar, team up with the Medes to the east. These are the rough mountain people to the east. And probably not as part of the teamwork, but they just happen to be attacking too around that time, the Scythians to the north. These are all attacking Assyria, nibbling away. And finally, in the year 612 BC, Nineveh falls. The remnants of what's left of the Assyrians go running off to Carchemish, and now there is a power vacuum. The question is, who's going to be the new superpower? And meanwhile, there's a king far to the west, in fact, even to the west of Egypt, and his name is Pharaoh Necho, and he decides, "I'm going to be the new superpower," and he's going to march all the way up to Carchemish to meet. The Medes are sort of out of it by now. They've gone back home, taken what loot they wanted, but to meet King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. And they're fighting for the possession of that part of the world, actually the known world. Winner take all. But notice King Necho, in order to get to Carchemish, he has to pass through Judah and Israel, and in particular, he has to pass through that city that guards the passes, that city of Megiddo. He's going to lose. The king of Egypt loses, and Nebuchadnezzar comes chasing him all the way back down. And Nebuchadnezzar comes down to kingdom of Judah. There is no more kingdom of Israel, but the kingdom of Judah. And that puts Babylon, just like Isaiah had promised to Hezekiah, that puts Babylon on the front doorsteps of Jerusalem. There are now going to be 3 deportations. The first one takes place in 605 BC as Nebuchadnezzar comes up against the city of Jerusalem, and he wins the battle, and he takes hostages from among the nobility of the Jews, including Daniel and his 3 friends. You know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by their Babylonian names, and Daniel also. And they're taken away as hostages. Now, we don't want to think of them as hostages like sitting in a prison cell. They're treated well. They're going to be raised as though they were good Babylonians. The idea being that they are both hostages and maybe future leaders, but that have been thoroughly indoctrinated in the religion and in the thinking of Babylon. But that's not the last time Jerusalem's taken. Jerusalem again rebels, and in the year 597 BC, again Nebuchadnezzar is back, and this time, when he captures the city, a total of 10,000 of the craftsmen are taken, including a prophet by the name of Ezekiel. And you think by now they're not going to do any more rebelling. God says, I've raised up Nebuchadnezzar, you just don't mess with him, you obey me, trust in me. And the Jews do not, and the king does not, and the last king, Zedekiah, he's just as bad as a couple of his forerunners. In fact, all 3 sons of Josiah who reign after Josiah has died, and all 3 are bad, and as well as a grandson. But in 586 BC, for the last time, Nebuchadnezzar comes now for the 3rd time. Again, he captures the city of Jerusalem. This time, the temple is destroyed, and all the rest of the inhabitants, not that doesn't mean every single man and woman, but generally speaking, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are taken into captivity. And Jerusalem now ceases to exist. It's left in ruins. And the southern kingdom of Judah ceases to exist, just like the northern kingdom of Israel had ceased to exist. We read in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 9, and speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, and he burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house he burned with fire. So, Kings versus Chronicles. Now, I've just been giving you the story of both of these books, but I really haven't distinguished between the books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Kings gives us the prophetic perspective, and judgments are sort of in our face. Well, that's the thing that comes most to mind. Chronicles tells us much the same story, but it gives us what we could call the priestly perspective. And the theme, instead of judgment, I think that's there, but there's a bigger theme of hope at the end of the day. In the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, wars are prominent. In the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the temple is prominent. In fact, rule of thumb: if you can't see it from the temple, it's not mentioned in Chronicles. Remember, in 1st and 2nd Kings, especially during the day of the divided kingdom, sometimes you're going to Israel in the north, sometimes you're going to Judah in the south, and it goes back and forth. You almost need a play card to sort of keep track of where you are. Am I in the north or I'm in the south? Chronicles doesn't do that at all. In 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you're only looking at what's happening in the south, unless you're looking at somebody that's having dealings with the kings of the south. If the king of Israel comes down and they go and either fight against each other or they're fighting a common enemy, then Chronicles talks about the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. But other than that, it's the view from the temple. In the book of Kings, it's the history of thrones. In the book of Chronicles, it's the history of the Davidic line. In Kings, you're looking at Israel and Judah. In Chronicles, it's mostly Judah, unless Judah is specifically doing something with or against Israel. Kings is really the story, it's a morality story. Are you going to do what is right? And in Chronicles, the story is of redemption, because the way it ends, you see, 1st and 2nd Kings ends, they've been taken away into captivity. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles ends the same way, except it has a couple more verses, and it talks about, yes, they're taken away into captivity, but at the end of the day, after the captivity, they're eventually brought back into the land. So we come to the end where Jerusalem is destroyed. We give the date of that, 586 BC. I haven't really mentioned any of the prophets. We'll see more of them when we go through the prophets, but some of the prophets around that time, Zephaniah. Jeremiah is an eyewitness to all these things. He's there when Jerusalem is destroyed, tells it both in the middle of his book and also in the last chapter again. We have other prophets like Habakkuk, maybe Obadiah around that time. Ezekiel, we already mentioned how he's with that second captivity taken, the 10,000 that are taken. And then Daniel, he's an eyewitness to the whole thing, although from the perspective of Babylon, because he's one of those first captives taken, one of those hostages taken, and he's going to be in Babylon for the length of the Babylonian captivity.